Rising up, back on the street. Did my time, took my chances. Went the distance, now I'm back on my feet. Just a man and his will to survive. So many times it happens too fast. You trade your passion for glory. Don't lose your grip on the dreams of the past. You must fight just to keep them alive. It's the eye of the tiger, it's the thrill of the fight. Listen up to the challenge of our rival.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Darren S, and I'm a senior security consultant for Cisco's APT group, which is Assessment and Penetration Team. Cisco's business model relies mostly on our large partner network, but there are some cases where Cisco sells directly to extremely large customers like top banks or the government, let's say. And the Cisco APT team provides external pen testing and security services for Cisco's direct customers. So what happened was from last talk, it seemed like sometimes I felt like perhaps I was going a little bit too far down the rabbit hole, and so I was going to go up a little bit higher, or sorry, go up into like a more simpler discussion and just talk about web app pen testing. And I was just going to give a micro lesson on this because there's a lot of talks on it, and it's really going from zero to hero. So today, what I'll talk about is how to start viewing web traffic. I'll introduce Burp, and then discuss my own methodology, and then I'll do a demo pen test, which will also cover a somewhat moderate vulnerability, something called PHP type juggling. There's some really good videos on that as well. So the situation is, the web browser is an immensely complicated piece of software, and we could spend days just talking about the web browser. It's so powerful that it can emulate a computer just in pure JavaScript. And because it's so powerful, computational artifacts can execute outside of the original specification for the program. And that gives rise to some very interesting security issues. But how do you learn these intricacies? I'm not certain anyone can truly learn all the nuances and intricacies of a web browser, even if they made it part of their life's work. And my recommendation is to start from the basic ideas and then move up into some more immediate concepts. And I thought this was something that was good to maybe start off with. And so my intention is to give a more hands-on and kind of a practical advice going down some roads that aren't necessarily well-traveled. So I'll go over some basic tools of a web application pen tester methodology. And I also believe that this kind of discussion will be a good basic building block if your intention is to study any kind of, let's say, cloud pen testing, which I can discuss at a later date. So how do we view the web traffic? And especially when it's supposed to be encrypted. And fundamentally, the problem is trust. So how do you establish these trust relationships? Well, the browser already trusts itself. So what most documentation says is just go right into Burp. The thing was, I found that actually it's probably better to start with just the developer tools. And you can get into the developer tools pretty simply. And let's say if you're using Chrome, up into the menu button, which is 3 dots. And similarly, it looks something similar. I think it's 3 lines in Firefox. And then you go into more tools and then developer tools. And it can bring up an interface that looks like this, and it'll usually be on the side. Inside the network tab, you can see what's going on in terms of what kind of traffic goes back and forth. And this is pretty handy for understanding. And I've used this in times when there are new browser features that I just simply didn't understand. I just want to see how things were working. But really, Burp is the primary tool for a web app pen tester. And you would use Burp as a proxy, meaning that you're using it as something that's sitting in the middle of your traffic before it goes to the internet. And you can have Chrome or your browser communicate with Burp using 2 different ways. Obviously, the most popular way is people use an extension. And this is the Omega Switch Proxy logo in Chrome. In Firefox, it's more common to use something called Foxy Proxy. And last a couple weeks ago, we talked about Selenium, how you could use Selenium. Basically, which basically calls Chrome in a special mode. And I'll demo it again later. And those will communicate through Burp. Now, Burp also has a means to launch its own version of Chrome, which is already trusted with, which I already self-set to trust Burp to be able to communicate out to the internet. So to set up Burp, you have to have established that trust relationship by installing different certificates. These certificates are self-generated from Burp itself, and you have the operating system know that that certificate is trusted either through the application, or you do it through your system certificate store. So Burp comes in a lot of different flavors. I've never used Enterprise personally, but I have used both the community and the professional version, and I can say it is well worth every dollar, and I'm not sponsored by Burp. The advanced and manual tools that they offer, that they talk about here, are really the key value. The one vulnerability scanner, it's not bad. It's pretty good for finding certain things, but really the bread and butter of it is going to be in these manual tools. And even though part of the job is going through a lot of false positives, this is a screenshot which from one of my recent pen tests, and it just has a bunch of things that we'll report, but it turned out all these were not very useful. The real value of a pen tester is discovering the false negatives. The top 5 most used functions in Burp that I use is the repeater, which imitates a command that was previously sent. Intruder, which sends a list of payloads, depending on where you can modify an existing request and put in different payloads and start having things play around. Extender, which adds a lot of different functionality within Burp. There's quite a few things, especially as new technologies come out. Some really cool people just contribute and have some really neat things that you could use. But I really like, if you're going to start with anything, if there was one extension I was going to use, I'd say start with Logger++, because it keeps track of almost everything that you're doing, provided that you have the computing resources. And then Interceptor, which is, it'll hold a packet, a message payload, before it sends it off to the server, and you can turn that on and off as you need it. And finally, message highlighting. So I'll highlight messages and keep track of context or states. And that's really a problem with Burp, is it doesn't know at this point I have finished logging in, or at this point I've finished, let's say you're checking Gmail, I've finished composing an email or something like that. And so message highlighting, I'll choose several different colors. You just come up with your own standard, just to go through when you look at your history of Burp, how it looks, and you can figure out what the context and what the state of what you were working with. My general process looks kind of like this, and it's minus a very often overlooked and underestimated step. So first, what you'll do is you'll browse through the application manually, and just try and get a feel for how it works. And it also populates the Burp state, and then in the background, Burp will start looking at all the requests that you made and try to figure out if there's anything worthwhile looking for. And then at that point, what I'll do is I'll profile the application technology stack. Might that be, say, Linux, PHP, Microsoft stack, it is using .NET. And then I'll use something called GoBuster. And GoBuster can be found on GitHub on GoBuster, or you can do an apt install GoBuster if you're on Kali. And I'll take note of, and while that's running in the background, I'll take note of any attacker controllable data, headers and parameters and whatnot. And while I'm at it, I'll make a quick threat model. This perhaps is another good topic. As I was writing this out, I happen to use Microsoft Stride. And I can go through a sample of how I would threat model this particular demo app that I was working with. And then finally, I'd automate anything tedious with Selenium, like the login process.
So Darren, quick question. So when you're talking about browse through the application, normally you're just basically walking through, going through the point and clicks, trying to get a feel for I guess what the actual site is.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Ideally, you'd have some, the application owner would do that for you, but sometimes some engagements, they don't even tell you what it's like. It's completely black box. They say, here's the app, it's all self-explanatory. But a lot of times it's not self-explanatory, as you could probably work with a lot of different sites and realize, oh, I never knew that about Amazon.com or whatever site you might be thinking of. So that's part of the whole process when you browse it. Now you can have Burp also spider everything, but you have to be careful when you're spidering sites. Sometimes you'll start going down a rabbit hole and you'll be going down different links that you weren't supposed to, and it probably won't encompass the scope of what you needed to do. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
All right, right on. So finally, the most overlooked and underestimated step of these tasks is writing the report and keeping track of what you did. So for all of my my interns and junior engineers, I tried to teach them the ethics of good reporting and trying to take very good notes. And so that all has a particular style. I introduce them what my style looks like, and then hopefully they adopt mine, but they don't necessarily have to. So at this point, I'll just discuss what the demo is, and then I'll take a brief pause for questions and answers. So I created a quick static website that has a hidden application, and it has the vulnerability in that application has a PHP type juggling vulnerability. I'll discuss what a PHP type juggling vulnerability is after we get to that point. And along the way, we'll walk through Burp, how to discover this hidden content that was on this site, and then how you can also use Burp to understand other tools like SQL Map. Maybe you've used SQL Map and you're like, wow, that's really cool, but I have no idea how it works. Well, you can use Burp to figure out what it does. Like it'll show you. It'll show you the send and the request, and you can try to understand. That's how I've learned myself. And then finally, we'll exploit the PHP type juggling vulnerability in my demo app. So at this point, does anyone have any questions?
I do, Darren. This is Rasul. How are you doing today, sir?
Absolutely. I'm great. How can I help you?
I was a little disappointed, not at you, but I went to the SANS GWAP course and they didn't talk about selenium, So you said you was going to cover everything. Will you be using selenium also just to kind of close out everything that you're doing to show the benefits of using that tool also?
Yeah. Selenium's not really a required thing. It's like one of these things I thought, hey, why don't you just try it? It's kind of neat. I think it's handy. I personally like it just because it visually looks different, and I'll explain why as I'm using it. Hopefully,
right.
And if I don't answer your question, please let me know.
All right, you did. I'm done. You go ahead and finish up.
All right. Any other questions?
I'm checking the chat room and no one has texted me, so I think you're good to go.
All right. So I'm going to share VirtualBox, and hopefully this time around, I also installed apps so everything can be visually bigger. And so this app is called You're Just Not My Type. I have a dating service. It's like just a stupid thing that doesn't work. Where's my other window? Hold on a second here.
And before you start,
Yeah.
can you make it bigger than that? Because the web browser is big, but I guess your
Everything else is
Linux,
small.
It's a little small.
Okay. Let me see if I can change that. Last time I just made my hold on a second. Display. Change the display size, resolution of the display. Just a second. Let's change the size of everything. How is this 200?
Yeah, it looks good. I had zoomed in as well, and maybe just me doing WebEx. It's
on
my end.
Is it better? Or do I need to go bigger?
Make it a little bit bigger if you don't mind.
I can do that, sure. Always hard for me to tell how large to make this thing. Make display change resolution of display. There we go.
Is anybody else seeing like the Spaceball screen, or is it just my screen?
Now it's just gray.
Yeah, hold on. I'm sorry. Hold on a second. I'm not even at the recommended resolution anymore. So it's kind of freaking out. Just a second. Let's try this.
Okay, no
Keep
problem.
changes. All right. Let's see. How's this? Is that better?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right. So I have two windows. I have two boxes. One is running Ubuntu, which has the app. It's Nginx plus PHP. Then this is the on the browser side. Now, the client side, sorry. And so now my windows are really big and I can't see it. Okay. So I have this, I got my command prompt here. Okay. And then I've got my little tips, a list of things that I like to do. And this is the website that it comes up. Okay. So now normally what people use when they connect through Burp, they'll use something called, they might use Foxy Proxy, which sets the proxy to communicate with the local host machine, 127.0.0.1 on port 8080. But like I said, I like to use Selenium, so we can do that. So the way I do that is I'll git clone my clean browser for Pentesting. Just make sure that's here. Oh, it's nothing in here. Oh, because maybe I cloned it. There we go. Maybe I just got to click clone it there. And then I just run it like this. And what it will do is it brings up a very nice browser web session for myself with an orange bar. Because in case that I'm actually doing things that don't require that might mean I need to research something, I like to use the browser that doesn't have the orange bars to do my research. So maybe I want to look PHP type juggling. That won't appear. This kind of thing will not appear in my burp state. So I try to keep these two things separate. Okay, so at this point, I can run Burp Suite. So I'll run Burp Suite. I can either use the Community Edition or the Pro, but I'll go with Pro today. Let me see, I'm not able to see. There we go. Whoops. Suite Pro. And when you start Burp Suite and you use the default options, it'll keep on the interceptor, meaning that nothing will flow, no traffic will flow through it and nothing will appear in the burp state until you turn it off, which is sometimes handy because again, maybe sometimes you want to highlight take notes inside of your burp state to keep track of this was when I clicked such and such, or I was maybe updating, looking at some other functionality, or this is something I think it might be worthwhile. So I have different colors for my own process, but everyone has kind of a different style. And Logger++ happens to be one of those things that allows you to be able to see different things, especially if you're using some of the other functions like repeater. So let's just start this up. Okay, so it's going to take a little bit here. In the meantime, I'm going to have, where's my, okay, we got that guy.
So Darren, while we're waiting for that to kick in, so you were talking about Foxy Proxy. You said you didn't want to use that, and that's when you kicked in the Selenium, correct?
Yeah, we could use, so traditionally people use, if you're going to use the setup for Burp, you'll use Foxy Proxy or you use the built-in browser. So there's three, if you remember from my presentation, there are three different, usually common ways. One, of course, the common way is not Selenium. Selenium's completely like a completely new thing. That's kind of my thing, my twist. That's why that from the previous presentation. But you can, I don't know if that was a question, but you can obviously, if you want to run things and you use the pre-configured browser, you can just click open inside of the proxy tab. You can click open browser, and it'll launch a Chromium version of the browser. One of the other reasons why I like to use Selenium is it uses your native browser as opposed to some kind of custom other thing like this. I never know if if there's some functionality that's not in this, that the browser that you're normally used to using has it. So that's kind of why I like using Selenium. That's another reason why I like using Selenium. But not to mention the scripting capabilities. I script out anything tedious, like the login process. Did that answer your question, Otha?
It did. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So is this guy going? He should be going. So we can just turn off the interceptor for now. And I'm going to just use Portswigger, although I could use Selenium because that was requested. And so at this point, it just did a get for 192.168.3.92, and I can remember this is the main browsing session. And in the history, you can see it. This is the get command. Whoops, I don't know how I launched the documentation, but this is what when you send something, there are different verbs such as get and post. They're actually called request methods, I think, these days, as opposed, because I think semantically speaking, there's other things like type or options, which is not strictly a verb, so they don't like to call them verbs anymore. I think it's request methods. But the primary ones that you'll get familiar with is get and post. And whenever you go to a web page, initially, you will initiate a GET request on the first page, which is /. And it looks like this. And there isn't much to this page. So imagine that I've gone through the app and I haven't found too much. At this point, I'll go through and try to use GoBuster. So GoBuster was an earlier version of, or I should say a later version of Dirtbuster. And Dirtbuster, let's see, what happened to my GoBuster? Man, had it queued here. Okay, there we are. So I've got a handy Dirtbuster command already populated. What you like to do is you'll go through directories using a word list. There's a lot of different word lists to use. The one that's built into Kali is fine for this demo. There's one called sec lists that I like to use. I think if you find it on GitHub, you go to sec lists. This one's pretty good, but you have to go and figure out which ones would suit for you for your particular situation. So you can see that they have in a lot of different situations. There's also the web shells, which is kind of not really a list, but nonetheless, the discovery section will be a pretty good start. So in this particular case, I'm going to just go through the common ones on my URL, which is 192.168.3.92. And when you run, you'll notice that, oh, hey, look, there's an admin page, there's an admin directory, and there's a test directory, which seemed kind of interesting. So perhaps I'll go to the admin directory. So /admin. And wow, there's some type of thing where there's a username, read only, and it has a password. So this is very contrived. I did it from the sense that I wanted to get some feel for the developer tools as well as how things would work. So in this particular case, when you try to log in, it'll tell you that this is an invalid user. It should be secret user admin account username, which would not necessarily be practical, but you'll notice that this field is read only. So what you can do is you can use developer tools or inspect element in this particular case, which will bring you into the developer tools. And you'll notice that the input was actually read only, but you can modify it. to be something else. And now I can type in secret admin account name. And then the server replies with authentication failed. The password should be this huge thing, which would be impossible to guess. And if you obviously if you type this here, it'll successfully log in. But that wasn't really the point. The point was to just show you that this is this password changes. Not to mention it would be very difficult to brute force. So let's go take a look at Burp now. So if you look at Burp, you can see that I went to the admin page. The post looks like this. It gives some, the messages that are appearing in this part are just from the bottom here. You can see from the admin, this is the HTML, but when it goes to actually do the login, it's sending the messages like this. Now, what you can do is instead of just going through the web interface and having to manipulate the username every single time, you can send this to something called repeater. So I right click and now I'll send to repeater. And then the message appears here. Then I can click send and you can see the message come back. Now at this point I can start playing. I can start saying, well, maybe admin might work, but that actually will not work. It turns out that you need to put in the secret admin account username, and then you can paste this here. And you should see the result. So this will bring us to the next point, which will be PHP type juggling. But before I go into that, are there any questions?
None in chat and none in no one's texted me, so I think you're good to go.
All right. So let's now go and take a deeper dive into the app. Now, this was an interesting thing that where PHP is a nice language, it's very flexible, but the type of variable and object can dynamically change. And so they describe this, unfortunately, the way to look at the different, sorry, let me before I start rambling, let me bring up the app. So the app, the way the code works is not this. This is the index and the login. Okay, so the login. The key would be pretty difficult to figure out because first it's based on time. You're doing an MD5 on this super secret, and even though MD5 is not really secure, you're also doing an MD5 on the HTTP user agent, and you're taking SHA-1 of the time, the user, and the seed. This is fairly, with this super secret, it would be pretty hard to brute force and guess. But what you can notice if you had, let's suppose you had access to the code, you notice that this object is being compared against this string, and there's a double equals. In PHP, if you want things to be exactly based on the type to match, you have to use 3 equals instead of 2 equals. So this is a common mistake. It's very easy to forget to type the extra equals. So what can you put here to make this pass? Well, let's look up and not use the, I'm not going to use my browsing session because I don't want to pollute my burp state. Because if I start putting in, like I start checking Gmail, my Gmail stuff, account, username, password, all that stuff's going to appear here. All the things that I research, like sec lists, is going to just appear here, and it just fills burp state with a lot of junk. So let's take a look at type comparisons of PHP. So in PHP, there's this nice table, and we can see if I use a comparison with equals, one of the things I can use is an array. An array will also match when I'm doing this comparison. So if I put in an array like this, whoops, I'm not in the repeater, sorry. I'm in repeater, and instead of using this, and it's just a left bracket and a right bracket, you'll see that I successfully logged in. And you'll also notice that I can do this for the user as well. Did that make any sense? Or is there any questions? Right. So that's kind of the long and story short of it. I can start automating with Selenium if it would be interesting to do that as the next steps. But that was the heart of the presentation. I didn't know if I wanted to go through threat modeling next, as if people like threat modeling, or if they're just go through anything else that was not clear.
I have a question,
So
Darren. I'm sorry.
Yeah, how can I help you?
What I'm looking at here in this gray part of the screen here, steps 1 through 6, are these your notes as far as the pen testing process that you use, if I may?
Yeah. This is what I had in my presentation. This is the process I'll do. I'll browse through the app normally. I'll try to profile the technology stack. In this particular case, I'll start jotting down, hey, this is running Nginx.
Interesting.
Right. And then and this is part of my notes. I'll have another document, like a Word document, that I'll just keep all my notes. And it's good for screenshots, because then maybe when you're writing up your report, it's going to be necessary. It's all things that you're trying to plan ahead for what you're going to write in your report.
So you can write your report based on your structure that you follow, like what you have here.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Eventually, yeah, depending upon, everyone has kind of different reporting styles in different companies. Generally, some people like to have a very narrative style, and it's helpful for those narrative conversations, but it's also good if you're just trying to write up a detailed finding, because here's the steps to reproduce. You have the screenshots, and if you did all your homework up in advance, that's good.
Sure.
And then, like I was saying, you'll look for attacker-controlled data inside of Burp. You'll see things like parameters. That's going to be kind of handy. And then you'll do a quick threat model. In this case, tampering and tampering is going to be important. So that's one thing here. You'll think maybe is repudiation, denial of service. Is escalation of service, escalation privilege, not really. Spoofing, it could be somewhere between spoofing and tampering. But anyway, that's you'll do a quick model in your head. Some people like to do it a little more formally. There's usually not enough time to do a really good threat model, especially for a large app. But I'll do something just to kind of just to organize my thoughts. And then finally, of course, the tedious tasks. I kind of demonstrated it last week or 2 weeks ago. It was sort of like what I had encountered, and had a pretty good finding out of it. So it was something like registration, and then an email gets sent out, and then there's a whole thing that you had to do. And so it was very tedious to be able to, and I knew there was something interesting in there because of some of the information that was coming back. There was some data that I could control as a result of that workflow. But it took a long time to get there, and so that was why Selenium was handy.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Darren, when you're requested to do a web app pen test, just for you being the tester, and let's just say it was I guess, what's your preference on do you have a minimum time frame that you need, to test a web app thoroughly?
Do I have a minimum time? Well, it depends upon the size of the app. We usually guess at these. They typically take 2 weeks, but some apps are huge. Depends upon the number of roles, how many pages. It's really dependent upon that, and we guess. To test it thoroughly, it sometimes depends on how much cooperation you get from the development team themselves. So if you have a lot of help because they're able to walk you through the app, and a really good measure is you can ask them, how long does it take to smoke test the app? If it takes them 2 weeks to smoke test the app, I'm not going to be able to test it in 2 weeks. Because just all those workflows, I don't even know them all, and I'm trying to figure them out. That's very difficult. But we can get as good coverage as information that we get back. And so that depends upon our clients.
So 2 questions for you, Darren. One, what is smoke test?
Oh, right. Smoke test is
when you do a penetration web app test, are you using the production environment or development environment? The development environment.
Okay, so a smoke test is if you have a continuous integration cycle. Let's suppose your app is just constantly being developed, just to make sure that nothing is on fire, and smoke test. You just make it's just complete sanity just to make sure that the application is still working. So they'd go through all the functionality in the website and just make sure it works. If it takes them, a tester who already knows how that site works, more than the time that it would take me to test it, then I'm not going to be able to get a very good coverage. If hopefully that answers that first question. And then the second question was, am I testing in production or development? Well, to answer that question, sometimes I am testing in production, in which case you cannot use the really aggressive tools. You have to be really careful because you don't want to take the site down. A lot of times we'll get a so-called staging environment, which is somewhere in between production and development, but it really depends upon the client.
Okay. Another question. So when you're going through your browsing through the site, right? Normally your points and clicks. Are you also looking at source code, or you just want to get an overall view of the actual site, and then you just go into the next phase of your web app pen test?
Yeah, you might want to look at things as you're going. The problem is that if you go too far down a rabbit hole and you're looking at source, you kind of lose track of the bigger picture. And so first I try to get a good big picture view of how this is the app. Here's all the pieces that work together. If you start looking at, all right, this is how the send email functionality, contact information works, you probably missed like the major function of, let's say if this was a dating website, right? You wouldn't figure out, oh, wait, I need to be looking at the chat functionality because that's going to be more important than say, help me if I have a problem. But it really depends. In general, I don't try to do that in the first stage. Maybe depending upon, let's say the first 10% of the pen test.
So when you're conducting a test, Darren, do you go off of, I guess, in your methodology, do you kind of go off of what you see from the scan results, and then from crawling the website manually to determine what rabbit hole you might want to go down? Or do you conduct a scan and say, well, and maybe a part of the scope of the work, say, let me go down and see and test what I can find out from the old swap top 10, as an example?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It really depends upon the site again and what you first encounter and your own experience as a tester. So you bring up some great points. Yes, the answer is basically yes, and depends how much time. So you try to, of course, you want to cover all your bases. So certainly go through what's more common, what is more probable, and that's part of the quick threat modeling process because the OWASP top 10 is going to cover some of these things and some of the functions you're going to see. Yeah, well, the site's completely static. I'm not going to see SQL injection. Maybe I'm not going to see SQL injection in this particular parameter because you've profiled this technology stack has pretty good, you're able to identify, well, this one generally is not going to be vulnerable to SQLi. So maybe I shouldn't be running SQLi because they are using some pre-canned function. It just, again, it really just depends. So you start prioritizing just based on what you're seeing, your own experience, and you just write it out in terms of your methodology. And then if someone ever questions you, you're already well documented and you can defend yourself.
Question, if you go out of scope while you're doing the pen test, what are some ways to deal with that?
I'm not sure what you mean. So I generally don't go out of, I won't do things that they won't ask me to do. So if I'm going out of scope, that's generally bad. So maybe I'm not understanding your question.
So say if you found something interesting and you decided to go out of scope, maybe if it's a cross-site scripting effect.
Well, a cross-site scripting attack would not be out of scope. I would hope not, if it's a web app pen test. But if you found something interesting, let's suppose you said you found something that you believe is cross-site scripting, you make note of it and you spend a certain amount of time in there, and but you really need to cover all your bases. So making sure that if you ran Burp and it flagged a bunch of issues, you have to make sure that first you go through and figure out all these things are false positives as best you can. Maybe you can't cover them all, but you cover the best ones that you can, especially if you're prioritizing them, because certain things like there's something like that I often see is this version of software, or no, let me think of something that a really good example was. It thought there was a session token. Like a lot of the session token ones are usually garbage in my scanners. But it's good to go through as many as you can, especially if you think there might be something. And you try to identify, especially when they're clustered. So you'll say that this group of them, after I've looked at, say, 3 or 4 out of the 50, that might be good. It just really depends how much time, again. But you try to go through them all.
So to ask Armando's questions a little bit differently, so you hear stories about people doing pen tests, and then when they're doing a network pen test, it goes into incident response because that person who's doing a pen test sees something that they have to immediately bring to the client's attention. They don't want to wait till 2 weeks to report. Is that something similar that you have seen in, as you're doing your web app? So you know what, you just can't wait to report to actually finish, but I need to kind of bring it to this person's attention immediately.
So that used to be a problem. It seems like the trend these days is not to do something like that. It isn't like 2 weeks and then you're completely in the dark. Clients seem to prefer much more communication these days. So that never seems to be a problem because of the constant communication, or we seem to be able to email whoever it is and just say, hey, look, I think there's a serious issue. I'd like to investigate it further. This is what I'm looking at. And then they'll let you go and do what you have to do. But if you're not being asked, it's generally not a good practice because the client might be upset that you're not spending time in what you're supposed to be doing. So that's a customer relation problem rather than a pen test problem, if you will. And it will depend upon your project management layer, so or engagement manager layer. It depends upon who's doing that.
Okay, and just another follow up. So when you create your web app pen testing team, how many members are on the team? Is it like, okay, I go to a customer, I have 10 servers in production that I'm going to look at, that's my scope of work. I got a project manager, and maybe, you're the lead, and then you have an assistant, or how does that work?
Yeah, so a project, it generally is pretty small. We're not that large. Our team is only 20 people. So a team of 10 people would be really massive. For our automotive projects, we have I think 5 or 6 of us. So that's quite big. But for a web app pen test, most web app pen tests don't exceed a couple people. So we'll also have a project manager, like you said, that's assigned to it. Typically, some other organizations, not necessarily Cisco, will use that role for the engagement management, meaning that they're managing the client as well, so that they're that interface. Our project management layer also does a lot of other things like keep track of hours, and there's a bunch of other accounting that Cisco does. But 10 people would be a huge app. I don't think I've encountered an app that required 10 people. 3 maybe. So you could have 3. It depends upon especially how it's structured and if it logically makes sense, because that app might be so big. But a lot of times there's a lot of technology reuse. So again, it really just depends. I don't know if that even answered the question. It's so vague.
No, you did. Thanks.
Then what's your philosophy on you run across a because opinions vary. You find a cross-site scripting or reflected cross-site scripting, you're able to make a pop-up box, the XSX box pop up. Do you try to use the developer tools, to see what you can do with that, phishing, credential harvesting or something of that nature, what's your thought process when you find a pop-up box? Do you report that to the client or not report it to the client because you think they're not going to fix it? Or do you need to take it a step further to show, hey, this is the damage that could be done, with this vulnerability?
Yeah, usually when there's smoke, there's fire. So if you have that alert box, it's pretty good. It's a good success. And then there's a lot of caveats. So you could report that. It's great to report it. Sometimes they'll fix it right away. Sometimes it depends upon the client. Some clients don't think that's usually a problem. Some clients think it is a huge problem, and then they just triage it. If you have 2 weeks to pen test something and you found reflected cross-site scripting, to try to do even more and to take it as far as you can go. If you found it and you have some spare time left over and you don't have all of your other tasks done, then that's definitely go for it. But I try to make sure that I cover all the scope first rather than try to go because it's cool and it's a lot of fun. I try to resist that urge, even though if I might do it on my own time, like outside of the hours of the pen test itself, to see if I can get it even further, help myself automate, maybe get something more interesting. But in general, it's better just to have it reported and written down as is, that this is an alert box, especially if you know that you have a very good relationship with your client. If the client thinks this is not a problem, it's just an alert box, then you might need to go a little bit further.
When you're doing so like how you have your methodology, or your steps that you're going to follow right there, do you have any um like standard requests, when you're doing a white box test, to say like, hey, I need 1 or 2 sets of just regular user credentials, maybe an admin credential. So if you checking, roles and stuff like that, can you speak on like, hey, when I got a client, I got a scope of work, they very cooperative, here are some of the things, that I asked for to make the process a little bit, you know, smoother so that you can maximize your time doing that scope of work?
Oh, absolutely. Credential, you brought up a great point. So I didn't cover scoping, but yes, in scoping, you'll definitely ask for how many roles do you have, and then what roles can you provide for me? You'll also ask for if you could get source code, because that will help accelerate things as well. But source code isn't always available. Sometimes it comes very late. I'm trying to, and I have a whole scoping document that I haven't really thought about everything. So I'm doing everything off the top of my head. I usually have, with that scoping document, I keep track of good questions to answer or ask. And then, let's see, I've probably missed quite a few other things. But, and I think in general, that's absolutely, you need to know what the roles are. What's the important parts of the things that those users can do, and what are the concerns that you have about each of these users? Are you concerned that one user can view the other user's data? So then now horizontal access control testing is important. Do I have to worry about a normal user becoming an admin user? Well, there's no such a thing as an admin user. These are the kinds of discussions that you'll just need to have. And as a matter of course, those are just, the conversation just generally tends to be very organic. I think I saw a question. Do you have an example of Burp finding vulnerabilities in a web app that I could share? Yes, I don't have one right here, unfortunately. Well, a good one is if you use the Retire.js plugin. So there's one called, if you go into the App Store, there's one called Retire. This is a pretty good one. What it'll do is it uses regular expressions to find vulnerable JavaScript libraries. And we'll report this out. A lot of times these libraries are patched. So sometimes if you have, especially if you have time to look through and see if if there is this library is still vulnerable, and especially if the way it's using it. Otherwise, you tend to rate it a little bit lower and just say, hey, you guys might want to check this. But this is a common one. I don't know if that answers your question, Ernest. Do I take notes on my virtual machine and then share them to my main computer via email? Yeah, I can't do that via email, but the way I do, I take notes on I take it notes on the host side, not the guest side. I tend to like to copy paste or take screenshots, and it's not I don't share them. I can't share them via email because of Cisco processes, but that might work for you. There's other ways, of course, sharing using like SMB share, some type of SMB mount might also work. I considered using OpenOffice. My machine's just I'm kind of RAM restricted usually because I have multiple machines. So OpenOffice would be also a good solution. But since my reports tend to be in Word, for better or for worse.
Darren, can you speak on if you had came from, and I'm not sure, you know, if you come from that environment, using a commercial web app scanner like a Kunix or a NetSparker or something like that, and having that automated to, find your vulnerabilities for you, and then you go somewhere else, and then you just using Burp, you know, um, what if any challenges or the methodology that you use to try to find the same amount of vulnerabilities or quality vulnerabilities in Burp that you would find in a commercial scanner.
So you want me to comment? Sorry, I just want to make sure I have that correct. So you want me to comment on the efficacy of commercial scanners versus a web app pen tester?
Yeah, and how you can close how can let's use me. If I've been used to using a commercial scanner, um, let's go with NetSparker or Kunis as an example. And then I change job roles and they say, hey, here's your Burp Suite Pro license. How does an individual, close in that gap right there?
Okay. I've never used either of those tools, but back in the day, I used to use IBM Rational, it was Rational at one point in time, is AppScan. AppScan. It was.
Okay.
It was not good. The biggest fundamental problem with all of these is that these tools is that it doesn't understand context, and there is no way that they can understand context. It doesn't understand the business importance of anything. So there's no way it could rank anything of importance, and you're just ending up having people just try to pick up the pieces. So this is where the effectiveness of an app pen tester comes into play, because they're able to make these judgment calls and they're able to work with these people and extract that information at a faster rate than any computer could. So that's how you close the gap. Now, are you going to be able to find exactly what those tools did? You might not, if you don't, especially if you don't have the proper scanners, whatever it was doing, and you didn't know how any of those ran. If you were able to run that tool through it, you could figure it out. Oh, which is a good point. Maybe I could show you that. So suppose that I wanted to use SQL map. Let's suppose that like I was using SQL map. Let's say here. And I want to understand SQL map, how that thing worked. Where am I? There we are. Is that Dirtbuster? This is, okay. That's Dirtbuster. There it is. So let's suppose you'd like to use SQL map, and I've wanted to do this on index.php. Now the thing is that you can have it go through Burp, port 8080. So let me just run it, and then you can see what requests it's running. Now I can obviously turn on the interceptor, and for every thing that it's trying it out, let's say ABC. you can see that it intercepted the request, and this is what it would have forwarded off. I can then highlight it or forward it at this point. This is the next request. I'm just going to turn it off and just let it run. But you can get an idea that this is the things that it's trying, and all those things will appear in your burp state, and that's how you would understand what it was sending. So whatever tool that you're using for your automation, this NetSparker, I'm sorry, I don't remember all of them, but you could use the same thing, have it go through burp and figure out what it was doing, and then run those kinds of tests yourself.
Got it. Got it.
Darren, I just had a question, and this is from my knowledge. Based on that first step, I saw your notes, but I just wanted to maybe ask a question that might go a little deeper into that first step as far as your approach to what you did.
Yeah, browse through the app normally, yeah.
Did you like, you know, do a net discover nmap and, you know, as far as the scanning process to find your target? What about ports? I just wanted to ask about that.
Absolutely. That's usually out of scope in a net app pen. So they don't usually ask for that. That's something that's more theoretical. If you're doing a red team type of exercise, that sure that would be open. But usually they'll say, here's the IP and this is what you're running. They're not caring. They're not going to care about the rest of like this is running on port on blah 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 blah.
Okay, they just give it to you by address.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
right. That's like I said, typically it's not very rare. If it's going to be something like that, it becomes like this huge IP ranges. And then it's more like an external, and then you might throw in a little web app pen test in there, but you don't try to go too deep.
Okay.
In your information gathering phase, do you have any other like web extension tools, you know, that you find pretty reliable or that you use to get quick information off of, like Wapalizer or Built with What Web or any of those things right there?
Yeah. So I generally don't use them. It becomes for myself. There's a lot of things that I usually have to do that I try to prioritize, and there's the information that I would need to gather is best learned through just using the app and understanding the functionality. So I spend most of my time there. I find that comes about pretty better than using automated tools that I don't know how it's working, and I don't know if it's going off into the weeds and I'm looking in some place that I don't need to be looking. So if I don't start with that first step before I start running some type of analysis spidering tool, I don't know what I'm going to be looking at. I could be looking at way too much. Okay. So Ernest asked. Hopefully, I don't know if I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question. Let's see. But Ernest was asking, can Burp be run on any website? And if so, what do you need to authorization to analyze the communication between your computer and the external web application? So Burp in passive mode can definitely be used at any point, especially if it's something open and you're just browsing to it, but you're not trying to use, say, the Dirtbuster. You won't use Dirtbuster on just any site. But you could use Burp because you're just browsing. It's not going to really take down surfaces, especially it's not going to be very aggressive. That's how I would use it.
As an example,
Darren, when you started, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Otha. You go ahead.
So, cool question. So, when you were getting started doing web app pen testing, you know, what was the top two things that you realized you had to learn outside of Burp Suite?
Top two things I learned outside of Burp Suite. I had to learn a lot. So
do three things then.
I had to learn how the browser worked. I came from an embedded environment, so I had no idea how any of this stuff worked. It took me a while. I mean, I kind of had like this conceptual idea, but it was very difficult at first. Let's see, other things outside of Burp that I had to use for web app pen test. You know, SQL. I didn't know how SQL map worked for a long time until I just fed it through Burp itself. That's how I started to learn how SQL map was used. GoBuster, certainly, that's great. It has its disadvantages. At the time, back in 2014, it was Dirbuster. The other tool there's other ones like Nikto. I find Nikto to be okay. I generally don't run it anymore because there's so many false positives. I find GoBuster to be a little bit more useful. And as apps have become more complex, I found that I spend more of that time trying to just understanding how that app is working. And so that browse through that application normally phase just becomes even more important.
Just to touch on your on your number one point that you have the asterisk by, is it, if we still have time, can you use like what is it, the test.php, the little practice
Yeah.
website, and just let that be an example of an application that you testing, and when you're going through it manually, what are you looking for and what do you make notes out of?
Well, unfortunately, that app's not complicated. So the test area it's just a directory right now. If I open it up,
Okay.
there's nothing in there in that directory. I wrote this literally today. So
No, what about not, and it don't necessarily have to be yours. How about the practice online one that's that test php.boneweb .com practice site.
Test PHP, sorry.
It's test php
Yeah.
.boneweb.com. It's the Akunix practice site.
Okay. Oh my gosh, this is gonna be complicated. I don't know if I'm gonna have time in 10 minutes to go through everything I would go through.
No,
But
just a overview of like, hey, I start doing this, or
sure. So we've
that.
got this test page. So I'm gonna start browsing categories. I'm gonna click this. I'll highlight this and maybe, this is this. I'll put a comment in here. This is the category page. The categories page had very little, huh? So there wasn't anything interesting in terms of parameters. Typically, let's see, what else do we have? Browse artists. There's a comment on this artist. It doesn't look like it does. Oh, maybe it does something. See, 1, 2, 3, submit. Okay. Ooh, so there's attacker control data there. So now I saw ABC 1, 2, 3. I can control what is being sent here. So this becomes pretty interesting at this point. So I'll take note of that and have something. There was reflected data. So maybe I'll put a star here, something like that, because then I can search based on comments and then come back to it and find something. Does that answer your question? I don't know if I just gave it a quick few minutes.
It was quick, and because I don't use the highlighter feature right there, and I can see how I could kind of maximize a little bit more of my time, doing those little comments and little notes that you did with that little highlighting feature, right there.
Right.
Yeah, that was it right there.
Okay, cool. Oh, Ernest says, do you need to have a dev background or coding background to do web pen testing? It certainly helps. So because I had a dev background, but it was not in web app, it helped me. So I don't know if it's a prerequisite. I know of people that have gone from NetPen and jumped directly into WebPen, and they're great. So there is no, I would not, let me put it another way. Don't think that coding is going to be beyond yourself. Just think of it as another skill that you need to be able to teach yourself, and you'll eventually. It's just you have to remember that everyone that's coders, they even have different hierarchies. You don't have to be the best coder, but if you build up your talent stack and you get better at coding, you will get more confidence to be able to do web app pen testing. So I would encourage you to try to do some coding, along with everything else that you're going to be building in your talent stack.
Hey, Darren, when you go back to the burp sweep, you mentioned something about reflective data And you said something about attack. How did you know that? I was trying to
Oh,
figure
right.
that piece out. If you could go back.
Okay, so what happened was, as when I clicked this, I can see I typed ABC.
Okay.
Because I typed ABC, that's something interesting because now that's controllable by me. I typed in ABC.
Okay, gotcha.
So does that mean I can send a link now to somebody and that from that with this link that has ABC or some scriptable payload? And then you have to look at, is that this being filtered, blah, 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 blah.
Okay.
That's when you use your payloads and all the other stuff to try to see if you can bypass this filter.
When you're at the end and doing the report, will you also include your comments and everything else that you do?
All my comments. So I try to highlight all the things that are maybe important to the client. I don't tell them everything that I had to do because it's probably that's just too much information. You have to choose something in between. And that depends upon your client. Some clients like you kind of learn this base. If you don't have any idea, you choose some method. You just choose something, and then you go with it. You try to be conservative in your estimates. So you try to balance it between a good amount of information. You think it tells a pretty good story, especially depending upon what kind of findings you have. So if you have some findings that tell a very good story, then yeah, then you try to be as verbose as you can. If you found absolutely nothing, which has happened very rarely. I've had one report where I had just almost zero findings, but it was, and those kinds of things you have to spin it differently. That's when you have to discuss almost everything that you did to justify it because you found absolutely nothing.
Darren, you mentioned the coding a moment ago. What would be the best route? Would it be Python, C, or which one matters to most? Which one matters
Ah,
most to you?
which one matters most to me? Well,
Yeah.
what matters most to me may depend upon what you end up looking at. Let's suppose you like looking at, let's suppose you just have an affinity for Microsoft technologies. I just encourage you to work with whatever ones that you find useful to build stuff with. C is I've been learning. I've been coding in C a long time. So for me to say C is my useful one, it's only just because it's useful because I know a lot of it. But there's other languages that are great for building a lot of stuff. Python's particularly great. You'll see a lot of tech companies that have used it to build up all of their technology stacks, and it's certainly not going away. So Python's a definitely great language, and it's easy to get. That REPL shell is awesome. I wouldn't. Some of my friends like Ruby, and some of them like Rust. Rust would be a great language to learn. I don't know Rust. I know C. You have to work with what you know and what resources that you have available to learn that. So for example, for me, I don't have often access to a Windows environment. C# and .NET and PowerShell would have been probably more useful if I encountered more of those environments. I had a recent pen test where I had to do some reversing in C#, and it was a bit rough for me, and I wish I knew C# better, but that's how things roll. Okay. Ernest asks, have you had to demo your findings to the client, or has your reports been sufficient? I've had to do both. So I have had to demo my findings. Sometimes the report is sometimes sufficient, but I've had to do both.
So, one more question on, and this is regarding to just practicing, right? So that website that you guys had mentioned, the Test PHP Von Web, I never even heard of it. Outside of OWASP Juice Shop, Damn Vulnerable Web App, was the Motidi or something. What are good websites? We have another gentleman who said that he's going to show us how he set up his web lab that he does for pen testing. And he's not a traditional web app pen testing. He's just trying to learn it as well. So how do you create your own lab environment to get your start? Do you use websites like this that Rasul mentioned, or do you use the OWASP JuiceSwap or the Over the Wire Hack Me sites? Or, what's a good one, or maybe it's all of them?
Yeah, there's so many to choose from. That's the great stuff. That's a great thing these days. It depends upon the topic I'm trying to learn. I think Pentester Labs is pretty cool. We give that to our interns. We've also used I think I saw some of the other things that but some of the other things that were listed in that document you sent, Otha. There's a lot of other sites that we also use for our interns, and just for me personally, from when I do setups, I have access to OpenStack, so we can spin up boxes kind of easily if I needed to create some specific environment. We also have AWS hosts that you can spin up that get charged into our department. But for me personally, if I'm doing it just on my own, I'll just use I'll use VMware or VirtualBox with Vagrant and just create my Vagrant environments. I'll just pull down Vagrant environments. And then I have to custom set whatever it is, because usually those technology stacks are not like plug and play. So it depends upon my engagement, what engagement I anticipate, and that's how I practice.
So if you do like bug bounty versus doing an application for a client, are there tools that are interchangeable, or do you go with one set of tools versus the other?
Well, it depends upon the job, and it depends upon what I'm looking at. So bug bounties, I'm not really a bug bounty person. I find the pay is not as good as taking up real jobs. But that's just me personally. If I was going to do it, and I was going to, because there were some things that had a bug bounty program, I found some interesting vulns. I'm basically using the same methodologies. I might use the same tools that I would have used because the technology stacks were similar in that particular case. But I can't speak too much in terms of bug bounties.
All right. There's a little bit of silence, so I'm assuming we're exhausted from your wisdom that you gave us. So definitely appreciate it. One more ask: Are there any questions or comments for Darren?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay.
I think I'm good, Otha. Thank you so much, Darren. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to help.
Okay. Well, with that being said, we'll call it wraps for the day. I will post a video as well. So for those who missed it, and I know the weekend's coming, so you may want to watch the video with your significant other and talk about web app pen testing.